It was 3:47 p.m. on Tuesday, September 15, 1964, when officers Patrick Sullivan and James Kowalski, both assigned to the 28th Precinct covering Harlem, walked into the Palm Cafe on 125th Street. Bumpy Johnson was sitting at his usual corner table, conducting afternoon business over coffee and cigars with several associates. The two white officers moved directly to Johnson's table, badges visible, hands resting on their service weapons in the universal police posture of authority backed by potential violence. "Bumpy Johnson," Sullivan announced loudly enough that everyone in the cafe could hear clearly. "You're under arrest for operating an illegal gambling operation, for conspiracy to distribute narcotics, and for assaulting a police officer during questioning last week. Stand up, put your hands behind your back, and come with us to the precinct, now." According to 7 witnesses who were present in the Palm Cafe that afternoon, and who spoke with the Harlem Gazette between September 16th and September 18th, 1964, Johnson looked up at the two officers with an expression somewhere between amusement and contempt, made no move to stand up, and asked a single question that made clear he knew exactly what was happening. "Which paycheck came in this week, Sullivan? Did Vincent Gigante pay you, or was it someone from City Hall?" Sullivan's face flushed red with anger. What happened next, according to all 7 witnesses, would become one of the most infamous moments in Harlem's history, a racial slur so vicious that even hardened criminals in the room flinched when they heard it. "Listen here, you N-word," Sullivan spat, his voice loud enough that everyone in the cafe went silent. "You think you're untouchable? You think because you run numbers in Harlem that you're somebody important? You're nothing but a N-word criminal. And I'm about to show you what happens to N-words who think they're above the law in my precinct." The cafe went absolutely silent. Everyone present, the waitresses, the customers, Johnson's associates, even the owner behind the counter, understood they'd just witnessed something that couldn't be taken back. A white police officer had just used the most degrading racial slur in the English language 3 times in 30 seconds while attempting to arrest one of Harlem's most powerful and most respected figures. According to witnesses, Sullivan grabbed Johnson's arm and tried to pull him out of his chair forcibly. But Johnson remained seated, his considerable weight and strength making it impossible for Sullivan to move him without assistance from Kowalski. "Resisting arrest," Sullivan said. "That's another charge. Kowalski, help me get this N-word criminal out of his chair and into the squad car." Kowalski moved toward Johnson's other arm, but before he could grab it, a voice from the cafe entrance stopped everyone. "Officers, what's the basis for this arrest?" Detective Marcus Thompson, 38, one of the few black detectives working out of the 28th Precinct, walked into the Palm Cafe at precisely 3:49 p.m., 2 minutes after Sullivan and Kowalski had attempted to arrest Johnson. Thompson had apparently been tipped off by someone in the precinct that Sullivan and Kowalski were planning an arrest, and that their arrest might not be legitimate. "This doesn't concern you, Detective," Sullivan said, his hand still gripping Johnson's arm. "We're executing an arrest warrant on charges of gambling, narcotics, and assault." Thompson walked closer, positioning himself between Sullivan and the door. "Show me the warrant," Thompson said in a voice loud enough that everyone in the cafe heard him clearly. "And show me the incident report about the alleged assault on a police officer last week that you just cited as one of the charges." According to witnesses, Sullivan and Kowalski exchanged glances that suggested they hadn't expected to be questioned by another officer, especially a black detective, about the legitimacy of their arrest. "The warrant is back at the precinct," Kowalski said. "We can show it to you after we bring Johnson in." "That's not how arrests work, Officer Kowalski," Thompson responded. "You need to have the warrant with you when you execute it, or you need to have probable cause for an arrest without a warrant. What's your probable cause? What evidence do you have that Mr. Johnson committed the crimes you just alleged he committed?" The cafe remained completely silent. Everyone present understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. A black detective openly challenging 2 white officers about an arrest in Harlem, demanding they justify their actions, refusing to simply defer to their authority because of their race and their seniority. Sullivan released Johnson's arm and turned his full attention to Thompson. "Listen, Detective," Sullivan said, his voice dripping with contempt. "I don't know what you think you're doing here, protecting this N-word, but you're interfering with a legitimate arrest. You need to leave this cafe and let us do our jobs before you end up in handcuffs next to him." Thompson didn't flinch. "I'm doing my job," Thompson said calmly. "My job is to ensure that arrests are legal and properly documented. You've alleged Mr. Johnson assaulted a police officer last week. Which officer? When did this assault occur? Where's the incident report? Where's the officer who was allegedly assaulted? Why wasn't Mr. Johnson arrested immediately after the assault occurred rather than a week later?" According to witnesses, Sullivan's face had gone from red to purple with rage. "You're going to regret this, Thompson," Sullivan said. "You're protecting a known N-word criminal over your fellow officers. That's a betrayal of your badge." "I'm protecting the law," Thompson interrupted. "The law requires that you have either a warrant or probable cause. You've shown me neither. You've made allegations without evidence. You've attempted to, physically, remove Mr. Johnson from this establishment without legal justification. That's not a legitimate arrest. That's kidnapping under color of authority." Thompson paused, making sure every officer understood what he was about to say. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to release Mr. Johnson. You're going to leave this cafe. And if you believe you have legitimate charges against Mr. Johnson, you're going to go back to the precinct. You're going to get a properly signed warrant from a judge, and you're going to return with that warrant and with proper documentation. Until then, Mr. Johnson is free to go about his business." Sullivan stared at Thompson for approximately 10 seconds, long enough that witnesses thought Sullivan might try to arrest Thompson along with Johnson. But finally, Sullivan stepped back from Johnson's table. "This isn't over," Sullivan said, pointing at Johnson. "We'll be back with a warrant, with everything properly documented, and then you're going downtown, and your pet N-word detective won't be able to protect you." Sullivan and Kowalski walked toward the door, but Johnson's voice stopped them before they could exit. Sullivan, Kowalski, both officers turned. "You tell Vincent Gigante and whoever else is paying you that this will not be finished until I decide it's finished. You understand?" Johnson's voice was calm, but every person in the cafe heard the menace beneath it. "This isn't over, not by a long shot." And Sullivan, "Use that word 7 times in 5 minutes. 7 times, I counted. You're going to regret every single time that word left your mouth." The 2 officers left without responding, and the cafe remained silent for several seconds after they'd gone. Then Johnson stood up, walked over to Detective Thompson, and shook his hand. "Thank you, Marcus," Johnson said quietly. "You didn't have to do that. Could cost you your career." Thompson shrugged. "Could, but I didn't become a cop to watch other cops break the law. Those 2 are dirty. Everyone in the precinct knows they're dirty. Someone needed to stop them." Johnson nodded. "I won't forget this. If you ever need anything at all, you call me. Understood?" "Understood," Thompson said. Then he lowered his voice so only Johnson could hear, according to what Thompson later told the Gazette. "Bumpy, be careful. Sullivan and Kowalski work for Vincent Gigante. Everyone in the precinct knows it, but nobody says it out loud. They're going to come back with fabricated evidence and a friendly judge who'll sign whatever warrant they want. You stopped them today, but they're not going to stop coming after you." Johnson smiled slightly. "Let them come. I've got plans for Sullivan and Kowalski. By the time I'm done with them, they're going to wish they'd never heard my name, and they're definitely going to wish they'd never used that word in my presence." According to William "Bub" Hewlett, Johnson's chief of security and closest associate, Johnson called an emergency meeting within 2 hours of the confrontation at the Palm Cafe. The meeting took place at 6:15 p.m. on September 15th in a back room at the Rhythm Club on 132nd Street. 15 people attended. Johnson's top security personnel, his attorney Theodore Green, several trusted associates who'd been working with Johnson since the 1940s, and 2 community organizers who had extensive connections throughout Harlem's churches and civil rights organizations. "Mr. Johnson was angrier than I'd ever seen him," Hewlett told the Gazette on September 17, 1964. "Not the kind of anger that makes you yell or break things. The cold anger, the calculating anger. The kind of anger that makes you plan exactly how you're going to destroy someone, step by step, and then execute that plan without mercy. Johnson began the meeting by explaining what had happened at the Palm Cafe, the attempted arrest on fabricated charges, Sullivan's repeated use of racial slurs, Detective Thompson's intervention, and Johnson's assessment that Sullivan and Kowalski were operating on orders from Vincent Gigante. Sullivan used that word 7 times, Johnson told the group, according to Hewlett's account. 7 times in 5 minutes in front of witnesses while attempting to arrest me on charges that we all know are fabricated because Gigante is paying him to harass me. That can't stand. If I let that stand, every corrupt cop in Harlem will think they can disrespect me, disrespect this community, and face no consequences. Johnson then outlined what he called a lesson in respect that Sullivan and Kowalski will never forget, and that Vincent Gigante will pay for. The plan had 3 phases. Phase 1, September 16 to 17, gather intelligence on Sullivan and Kowalski, their routines, their schedules, their vulnerabilities, who they worked for besides Gigante, what other corrupt activities they were involved in. Phase 2, September 17 to 18, detain both officers separately, extract detailed confessions about their corrupt activities, and obtain written documentation that could be used as leverage against them, against Gigante, and against the NYPD. Phase 3, September 18 to 19, use the confessions as leverage to negotiate with the NYPD, ensuring that Johnson would face no future harassment from corrupt officers and ensuring that Sullivan and Kowalski understood the consequences of disrespecting Johnson and using racial slurs against him. The plan wasn't about revenge through violence, Hewlett explained. Mr. Johnson could have had Sullivan and Kowalski killed easily, but killing them would have brought the entire NYPD down on Harlem, would have created martyrs, would have started a war that would hurt the community. Instead, Mr. Johnson wanted to destroy their credibility, expose their corruption, and turn them into examples of what happens when corrupt cops think they're untouchable. That was smarter than violence. That was permanent. Over the next 24 hours, from the evening of September 15th through the evening of September 16th, Johnson's intelligence network gathered extensive information about Sullivan and Kowalski. According to the intelligence gathered, both officers had been on Vincent Gigante's payroll for approximately 8 years, receiving between $300 and $500 per month each to provide protection for Gigante's gambling operations and to harass Gigante's competitors, which included Johnson. Sullivan lived in Queens with his wife and 2 teenage children. He left for his shift at the 28th Precinct every morning at 6:15 a.m., driving a 1962 Ford Fairlane. He had gambling debts of approximately $8,000, debts that made him vulnerable to pressure from organized crime figures who could threaten to call in those debts if Sullivan didn't cooperate. Kowalski lived in the Bronx with his wife. He typically left the precinct around 11 p.m. after his evening shift and drove home alone on a route that took him through isolated areas where an interception would be easy and unlikely to attract witnesses. Both officers had complaints filed against them for excessive force. Sullivan had 7 formal complaints filed between 1956 and 1964. Kowalski had 4, but neither officer had ever been disciplined because their supervisors had consistently dismissed the complaints as unfounded. The intelligence showed us that Sullivan and Kowalski were exactly what we thought they were, Hewlett said. Corrupt cops who'd been getting away with corruption for years because their supervisors either didn't care or were taking money themselves. They thought they were protected. They thought being white cops in Harlem meant they could do whatever they wanted and face no consequences. Mr. Johnson was about to teach them that protection has limits. James Kowalski left the 28th Precinct at 11:15 p.m. on Wednesday, September 16th, 1964 to 24 hours after the failed arrest attempt at the Palm Cafe, and walked to his car parked 2 blocks away on 126th. According to the official missing person report filed by Kowalski's wife on Thursday morning, Kowalski never made it home that night. His car was found the next morning, still parked on 126th Street, undamaged, with no signs of struggle. What the official report didn't mention, but what 3 witnesses who worked for Bumpy Johnson later described to the Gazette, was that Kowalski was approached by 4 men as he reached his car. The men identified themselves as working for Johnson and politely but firmly suggested that Kowalski accompany them to a meeting with Mr. Johnson to discuss Tuesday's arrest attempt and the racial slurs that Officer Sullivan had used. The men made clear that Kowalski had a choice, Hewlett said. He could come voluntarily for a conversation, or he could be forced to come. Either way, Mr. Johnson wanted to talk to him about who'd paid him to arrest Mr. Johnson, about Officer Sullivan's use of racial slurs, and about what other corrupt activities Officer Kowalski had been involved in during his years working in Harlem. Kowalski chose to come voluntarily, which was smart on his part. Kowalski was taken to an empty warehouse in the Bronx, outside the NYPD's immediate jurisdiction and far enough from Harlem that any noise wouldn't attract attention from people who might recognize Kowalski or care about what was happening to him. According to Hewlett, Johnson was waiting in the warehouse when Kowalski arrived, along with Hewlett and 3 other associates. Mr. Johnson explained the situation to Officer Kowalski very clearly, Hewlett recounts. Mr. Johnson said, "You and your partner tried to arrest me yesterday on fabricated charges. Your partner used the N-word 7 times in 5 minutes while attempting that arrest. I want to know who paid you to do it. I want to know how much they paid you. I want to know what other corrupt activities you've engaged in, and I want you to write down the names of every other cop in the 28th precinct who's taking bribes, especially from Vincent Gigante. You're going to write all of that down in your own handwriting. You're going to sign it, and then we're going to have a discussion about what happens next. And Officer Kowalski, every time your partner used that word yesterday, you stood there and said nothing. You didn't stop him. You didn't correct him. You let him disrespect me and disrespect this entire community with that word. So understand, you're not just answering for your corruption, you're answering for your cowardice and your complicity in racism." According to Hewlett, Kowalski initially refused, claiming he'd done nothing wrong and demanding to be released. But Johnson's associates made clear that refusal wasn't an option. Kowalski could write the information voluntarily, or he could be encouraged to write it through methods that would be unpleasant, but not permanently damaging. After about 30 minutes of discussion and some physical persuasion, Hewlett says delicately, Officer Kowalski decided cooperation was his best option. He wrote for approximately 2 hours, producing a detailed confession about his own corrupt activities and a list of 23 other officers in the 28th precinct, who he knew were taking money from Vincent Gigante's organization. The list included names, approximate amounts of bribes received, and what services the cops were providing in exchange for the money, primarily protection for Gigante's gambling operations and harassment of Gigante's competitors, which prominently included Johnson. Kowalski also wrote about Sullivan's history of using racial slurs when dealing with black suspects and black residents of Harlem, noting at least a dozen specific incidents where Sullivan had used the N-word or other derogatory terms. Kowalski admitted he'd never reported Sullivan's racist language because that's just how Sullivan talks, and because reporting it would have made Kowalski unpopular with other white officers who either shared Sullivan's views or tolerated them. Kowalski signed his confession and his list, was kept in the warehouse under guard, and was told he'd be released once Johnson had verified the information and had collected similar information from his partner, Officer Patrick Sullivan. Patrick Sullivan left his home in Queens at 6:05 a.m. on Thursday morning, September 17, 1964, driving toward the 28th precinct for his shift that was scheduled to begin at 7 a.m. According to his wife's later testimony to investigators, Sullivan had been nervous all day Wednesday after Kowalski failed to come home Tuesday night. He'd talked about taking sick leave until the situation with Kowalski was resolved, but had ultimately decided that failing to show up for work would make him look guilty of something. Sullivan never reached the 28th precinct. His car was found abandoned on the Triborough Bridge at approximately 8:30 a.m. Doors unlocked, keys still in the ignition, no signs of struggle. What investigators didn't learn until much later was that Sullivan had been stopped at a police checkpoint on the Triborough Bridge, a checkpoint that consisted of 4 men dressed in police uniforms operating what appeared to be a legitimate roadblock to check for outstanding warrants and vehicle violations. Sullivan had shown his police identification, expecting to be waved through as fellow officers always waved each other through such checkpoints. Instead, he'd been asked to step out of his vehicle for irregularities in his vehicle registration, had been surrounded by the 4 officers, and had been informed that he was being detained on orders from Bumpy Johnson, specifically because of the racial slurs Sullivan had used at the Palm Cafe on Tuesday, September 15th. Officer Sullivan was taken to the same warehouse where Officer Kowalski was being held, Hewlett explains. Mr. Johnson greeted Sullivan personally and explained the same thing he'd explained to Kowalski. "You're going to tell me who paid you to arrest me. You're going to tell me about your corrupt activities. You're going to write down the names of every corrupt cop you know. But more than that, Officer Sullivan, you're going to explain to me why you thought it was acceptable to use the N-word 7 times in 5 minutes while attempting to arrest me on fabricated charges. You're going to write down every time you've used that word or other racial slurs in your career as a police officer. And you're going to write an apology for using that word, an apology that I may or may not accept, depending on how sincere it is." Sullivan reportedly was less cooperative than Kowalski initially, claiming he was a decorated officer with 15 years of service, that kidnapping a police officer was a crime that would send Johnson to prison for life, that the entire NYPD would be searching for him and would show no mercy when they found who'd taken him. Johnson's response, according to Hewlett, who was present during the conversation, was calm and direct. "Officer Sullivan, the NYPD doesn't care about you as much as you think they do. You're a corrupt cop who takes bribes from Vincent Gigante. Your superiors know you're corrupt. Your fellow officers know you're corrupt. The only reason you haven't been arrested yourself is because corruption is so widespread in the NYPD that investigating you would require investigating dozens of other cops who are doing exactly what you're doing. So don't threaten me with the NYPD coming to rescue you. The NYPD is going to be more interested in covering up your corruption than in rescuing you from the consequences of that corruption." Johnson paused, then continued. "And as for your use of racial slurs, that's not just corruption, Officer Sullivan. That's racism. That's you using your badge and your gun to degrade and dehumanize black people in Harlem, people you're supposed to be serving and protecting. You think that word gives you power over me? You're about to learn that word has consequences when you use it against the wrong person." After what Hewlett describes as several hours of discussion and physical persuasion, similar to what Kowalski had experienced, Sullivan began writing. His confession was even more detailed than Kowalski's. Sullivan had been on Vincent Gigante's payroll for nearly 8 years, receiving approximately $60,000 in total bribes during that time. He'd provided services including advance warning about raids, protection for Gigante's gambling operations, harassment of competitors to Gigante's operations, and fabrication of evidence to arrest people Gigante wanted arrested. Sullivan also wrote about his use of racial slurs throughout his career. He documented at least 40 specific incidents where he'd used the N-word or other derogatory terms when dealing with black suspects, black witnesses, or black residents of Harlem. He admitted that he'd used such language deliberately to intimidate and degrade, believing that his position as a white police officer made him immune to consequences. His written apology, which Johnson had demanded, was 3 paragraphs long and read, in part, "I used the N-word 7 times on September 15, 1964, while attempting to arrest Ellsworth Johnson. I used that word deliberately to degrade Mr. Johnson and to assert my authority over him. I was wrong. I have used that word and other racial slurs throughout my career as a police officer, believing that my badge protected me from consequences. I was wrong. I apologize to Mr. Johnson and to the Harlem community for my racist language and my abuse of authority." Sullivan signed both his confession and his apology, though according to Hewlett, the apology was clearly written under duress and lacked genuine remorse. Mr. Johnson read Sullivan's apology and said, This apology is worthless because you don't mean it, Hewlett recalls. But that's fine. I don't need your remorse. I need your silence and your compliance going forward. And I need Vincent Gigante to understand that paying cops to harass me has consequences that he won't like. At 2:15 p.m. on Friday, September 18, 1964, approximately 40 hours after Officer Kowalski disappeared and 32 hours after Officer Sullivan disappeared, Bumpy Johnson walked into the 28th Precinct headquarters carrying a leather briefcase, accompanied by his attorney Theodore Green and by two bodyguards who positioned themselves near the entrance while Johnson approached the front desk. "I'm here to see Captain Morrison," Johnson told the desk sergeant. "Tell him Bumpy Johnson would like to discuss the current whereabouts of Officers Patrick Sullivan and James Kowalski, and would like to discuss certain irregularities in police conduct that have come to Mr. Johnson's attention recently. Specifically, the use of racial slurs by Officer Sullivan during an attempted arrest on September 15th. According to the desk sergeant's later testimony, the precinct headquarters went absolutely silent when Johnson made this announcement. Every officer present understood immediately that Johnson was connected to the disappearances of Sullivan and Kowalski, and that Johnson was bold enough, or crazy enough, to walk directly into the precinct to discuss those disappearances with the precinct captain. Captain Robert Morrison, 52, emerged from his office within 2 minutes, accompanied by Detective Lieutenant Frank Chen, 45, who supervised detective operations in the precinct. Both men looked at Johnson with expressions that combined anger, fear, and grudging respect for Johnson's audacity in appearing at the precinct while two of Morrison's officers were missing and presumably in Johnson's custody. "Mr. Johnson," Morrison said coldly, "you're either the bravest man in Harlem or the stupidest. Come into my office, now. Your attorney can accompany you. Your bodyguards stay in the lobby." Johnson, Green, Morrison, and Chen went into Morrison's office and closed the door. According to Green, who recounted the conversation to the Gazette on September 18th, the meeting began with Morrison making threats and demands. "Where are my officers, Johnson? What have you done with Sullivan and Kowalski? If they've been harmed, I swear to God I'll have you arrested for kidnapping and assault on police officers and every other charge I can think of. You'll spend the rest of your life in prison. Now tell me where they are, and tell me now." Johnson opened his briefcase, removed 2 handwritten documents, the confessions and lists that Sullivan and Kowalski had written, and placed them on Morrison's desk. "Your officers are safe," Johnson said calmly, according to Green's account. "They're being held in a secure location where they're being treated well, where they're being fed regularly, where they're not being tortured or abused beyond what was necessary to encourage them to write these confessions. I'll release both officers unharmed within 24 hours after you and I reach an understanding about certain matters." Morrison picked up the documents and began reading them, and his face went white as he realized what he was looking at. "These are handwritten confessions," Johnson continued, "written by Sullivan and Kowalski in their own handwriting and signed by them. The confessions describe in detail their corrupt activities over the past 8 years. How much money they've received from Vincent Gigante, what illegal services they've provided in exchange for that money, and the names of 47 other officers in this precinct who are also taking bribes." Morrison looked up from the documents, his expression stunned. "More importantly," Johnson continued, "Officer Sullivan's confession includes detailed documentation of his use of racial slurs throughout his career, including his use of the N-word 7 times in 5 minutes on September 15th while attempting to arrest me on fabricated charges. Sullivan has admitted, in his own handwriting, that he used racist language deliberately to degrade me and to assert white authority over black residents of Harlem." Johnson paused to let that sink in, then continued. "I have the original signed confessions in a safe location. What you're reading are copies. If anything happens to me, if I'm arrested, if I'm harmed, if I have any problems with police harassment going forward, those original confessions get delivered to the New York Times, to the Daily News, to the Amsterdam News, and to the FBI." Johnson leaned forward. Captain Morrison, September 1964 is 3 months after the Civil Rights Act was signed into law. 3 months after President Johnson signed legislation outlawing discrimination and protecting Black Americans' civil rights. And Officer Sullivan used the N-word 7 times while attempting an illegal arrest of a black man in Harlem. That's not just corruption. That's a federal civil rights violation. Those confessions document systematic racism by white police officers operating in a black community. If those confessions become public, you're not just facing a corruption scandal. You're facing federal civil rights investigations. You're facing national media attention about racist cops in Harlem violating the Civil Rights Act 3 months after it became law. You're facing protests, investigations, congressional hearings, and the complete destruction of this precinct's reputation. Morrison stared at Johnson, the confession still in his hands, clearly struggling to process what he was being told. "This is extortion," Morrison said finally. "You're trying to blackmail the NYPD." "No," Johnson corrected. "I'm offering the NYPD an opportunity to avoid a scandal that would destroy this department." "I don't want money. I don't want favors. I want one very simple thing. I want to be left alone. I want corrupt cops who are on Vincent Gigante's payroll to stop harassing me on behalf of their employer. And I want racist cops like Officer Sullivan to understand that using racial slurs against black residents of Harlem has consequences, even when those cops have badges and guns." Johnson continued, "Here's the deal I'm offering. I release Sullivan and Kowalski unharmed. They return to duty. You conduct no investigation into their disappearances. You accept their story that they took unauthorized leave for personal reasons, and you discipline them with suspensions, but not with termination. In exchange, you ensure that I am not harassed by police going forward. Legitimate investigations based on actual probable cause are fine. I understand that's part of doing business in my line of work. But fabricated arrests, planted evidence, harassment paid for by Vincent Gigante, or by politicians who don't like that I won't work with them, that stops immediately." Johnson's voice hardened. "And here's the other part of the deal, Captain Morrison. Officer Sullivan never uses that word again. Not in Harlem, not anywhere in this city, not in his entire career. You make sure Sullivan understands that if I ever hear that he's used racial slurs again, those confessions get published immediately and he gets destroyed. Not just his career, but his reputation, his pension, everything. Vincent Gigante's name appears 43 times in these confessions. 43 times officers describe receiving money from him, taking orders from him, harassing his competitors on his behalf. That documentation goes to federal prosecutors, and Gigante faces charges that could send him to prison for 20 years. Do you think Gigante wants that? Do you think the 47 officers named in these confessions want that? Do you think Captain Morrison wants to explain to the police commissioner why nearly 40% of officers under his command were corrupt, and he never noticed?" Johnson stood up. "That's the deal. Take it, or spend the next year dealing with the biggest corruption and civil rights scandal in NYPD history, with Officer Sullivan's documented racism at the center of it, 3 months after the Civil Rights Act became law." According to Green, Morrison and Chen sat in silence for approximately 2 minutes, reading and rereading the confessions, occasionally looking at Johnson with expressions that combined hatred and helpless recognition that Johnson held all the leverage in this negotiation. Finally, Morrison spoke. "Where are Sullivan and Kowalski?" "They'll be released tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. at the corner of 125th and Lenox," Johnson said. "Unharmed. They'll tell you they were held by unknown parties who questioned them about police corruption and who released them after completing their questioning. You'll accept that story without investigating further. Do we have an understanding?" Morrison stood up, walked to his window, looked out at Harlem for a long moment, then turned back to Johnson. "We have an understanding," Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sullivan and Kowalski get released unharmed. We don't investigate their disappearances, and you don't experience harassment from corrupt officers going forward. But Johnson, if you ever try something like this again, if you ever kidnap another officer, if you ever threaten this department again, I will personally destroy you, regardless of what lists you publish or what scandals you create. Do you understand me? Johnson extended his hand to Morrison. Morrison stared at the hand for several seconds before reluctantly shaking it. "I understand perfectly, Captain," Johnson said, "and I hope you understand that I meant every word I said. One more fabricated arrest, one more incident of harassment from cops on Gigante's payroll, one more time that any officer under your command uses racial slurs against me or anyone else in this community. Those confessions get published within hours, and this whole precinct comes down. Vincent Gigante's name gets sent to federal prosecutors with documentation that he's been corrupting police officers for years. And Officer Sullivan's documented racism gets sent to civil rights organizations, the FBI, and every newspaper in New York. Peace or war, Captain Morrison? I'm offering peace. I suggest you take it." Johnson, Green, and the two bodyguards left the 28th precinct at 2:47 p.m. According to witnesses in the precinct lobby, every officer watched Johnson leave in complete silence, understanding that they'd just witnessed something unprecedented, a criminal walking into police headquarters, admitting he'd kidnapped two officers, and walking out free because the criminal held leverage that the police couldn't counter. Officers Patrick Sullivan and James Kowalski were released at the corner of 125th Street and Lenox Avenue at 8:03 a.m. on Saturday, September 19, 1964, exactly where and when Bumpy Johnson had promised they'd be released. Both men were unharmed beyond bruises consistent with the physical persuasion that had encouraged them to write their confessions. Both men immediately reported to the 28th Precinct, where they were debriefed by Captain Morrison and Lieutenant Chen. According to the official report filed by Morrison, Sullivan and Kowalski claimed they'd been kidnapped by unknown parties, who'd questioned them about police corruption, who'd forced them to write confessions and lists of corrupt officers, and who'd released them after obtaining the information they wanted. The official report made no mention of Bumpy Johnson, made no connection between the kidnappings and the failed arrest attempt on Tuesday, September 15th, and concluded that the kidnappers' identities remained unknown and that investigation was ongoing. The unofficial reality, known to everyone in the 28th Precinct but never spoken aloud, was that Bumpy Johnson had kidnapped two officers who'd tried to arrest him on fabricated charges paid for by Vincent Gigante, had extracted confessions that could destroy the precinct and create federal problems for Gigante if made public, and had forced the NYPD to negotiate rather than retaliate, because the alternative was a scandal that would devastate the entire department and expose Gigante to federal prosecution. Sullivan and Kowalski were suspended for 30 days without pay for unauthorized absence from duty, but faced no criminal charges and returned to active duty in late October 1964. According to multiple sources within the precinct, both officers were warned by Captain Morrison that any future corrupt activities would result in immediate termination and possible prosecution, and that the informal protection they'd enjoyed from supervisors who'd overlooked their corruption was permanently withdrawn. More significantly, according to Detective Marcus Thompson, Sullivan never used racial slurs again during his remaining years on the force. After September 1964, Sullivan and Kowalski were the most honest cops in the 28th Precinct, Thompson said. They'd learned that corruption had consequences, that Bumpy Johnson was more dangerous than Vincent Gigante when Johnson decided to fight back, that their supervisors wouldn't protect them if they got caught again. And Sullivan specifically learned that using the N-word against Bumpy Johnson, or against anyone in Harlem, would cost him everything he had. Fear is a powerful motivator for reform when fear is applied properly. Both officers served out their remaining years on the force doing legitimate police work, and both retired in the early 1970s without further incident. The confessions that Bumpy Johnson extracted from Sullivan and Kowalski, and the threat to publish those confessions if police harassment continued, fundamentally changed how the NYPD operated in Harlem for the remainder of the 1960s. Officers who'd been taking regular bribes from Vincent Gigante to harass Johnson's operations either stopped taking the bribes or stopped providing the harassment, understanding that Johnson now had documentation that could destroy them and could create federal problems for Gigante if they continued their corrupt activities. After September 1964, Bumpy experienced significantly less police harassment, Theodore Green said. There were still legitimate investigations when Johnson's activities warranted them, still arrests when police had actual probable cause. But the pattern of fabricated arrests, planted evidence, and harassment for hire by corrupt cops working for Vincent Gigante, that stopped almost completely after September 1964. More significantly, according to civil rights activists working in Harlem at the time, police use of racial slurs declined noticeably after September 1964, not because officers suddenly became less racist, but because word spread quickly through the NYPD that Bumpy Johnson had documented Officer Sullivan's use of the N-word and had nearly destroyed Sullivan's career and the entire 28th precinct because of it. Cops learned that racist language had consequences when used against black residents of Harlem, especially when those residents had power and leverage, said Reverend Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., speaking at Abyssinian Baptist Church in October 1964. What Bumpy Johnson did in September was more effective than a dozen civil rights marches. He showed that documentation of racism and corruption, combined with the threat of public exposure, could change police behavior when moral appeals and protests couldn't. The confessions themselves, which remained in Johnson's possession until his death from a heart attack in July 1968, provided remarkable documentation of how Vincent Gigante had systematically corrupted police operations in Harlem during the late 1950s and early 1960s, and how white police officers had used racist language with impunity throughout their careers, believing their badges protected them from consequences. The confessions were destroyed after Johnson's death, according to explicit instructions Johnson had left. Family members reportedly burned the original documents to ensure they couldn't be used against anyone after Johnson was gone. Bumpy took the confessions to his grave, Hewlett said. He'd used them to protect himself for 4 years, from September 1964 until July 1968. During those 4 years, police harassment of Johnson's operations dropped dramatically because corrupt officers understood Johnson had documentation that could destroy them. And racist language by police officers in Harlem declined because officers understood that documented racism, especially post-Civil Rights Act, could create federal problems that their superiors wouldn't protect them from. When Johnson died of natural causes, there was no need to publish the confessions anymore, so they were destroyed. But their legend lived on. The list that named Vincent Gigante 43 times, the list that documented Officer Sullivan's use of the N-word 7 times in 5 minutes, the list that brought the NYPD to its knees and forced them to negotiate with a black man they'd tried to arrest on fabricated charges.